So, back to rules of engagement, we understand that we have to maintain confidentiality within the parameters that we spoke of before, but you need to think about fitness for duty for your own peers, and are you able to at all times provide help for people? I promise you this, you'll find this kind of work exhausting and you can't help everybody every day. That's why we have multiple people on a team. Your own fitness for duty is critical, but you need to be aware that the impact this job has on your other peer members can influence their ability to help as well. Something else to think about structurally is, what's your protocol going to be on reaching out to people who've been off the job for a while? In my experience in peer support, people only have two complaints when they've been off the job for a while. One is the employer never got off their back and hounded them on a back to work program. And the thing they're more annoyed by is that nobody called for a year. Hear it all the time. So peer support people aren't part of that plan. You work independently of any arrangement. Always check in on people. Just make sure that they're not alone. We're not looking for an update. You're not trying to assess their condition. Just make sure that they know that there's resources available to them, and you're one of them. Also, think about family services and what you're going to provide. Many peer teams like to think we can provide programs for families, but it's very, very difficult. Anytime you have a major incident in the workplace, all of your peer support resources get used up almost instantly. But you may be able to have a relationship with the adjoining community where there may be a peer team on, the fire department in the next county, or an ambulance service, or a law enforcement community may have some help for families. And generally speaking, they'll be happy to reach out and happy to help, and you could do the same for them in a similar circumstance. Think about that. Also, in terms of the rules, you need a protocol for response and notification. There's going to be times where the peer support folk need to be contacted early in an organizational crisis, and then there's going to be times where they're going to get missed because nobody thought it was their job to call. So this needs to be part of a dispatch protocol. This needs to be part of your organizational wellness conversation. This is also where we use that software we were talking about that allows you to track people and make sure that people need to get involved are getting involved. So also bear in mind that your peer members are going to be exposed to the same traumas that the others are responding to. If you have 6 trucks roll up on something horrifying and there's peers on those trucks, those peers aren't going to be a whole lot of use to your team or the organization for a while because they're exposed to that trauma. They actually need help. They can't provide help. It's very important to not double expose peers. So we need to set a small parameter on the whole nature of talking about people and their concerns and their issues. When you're having team meetings and making sure that the people who needed to be contacted have been contacted and are happy with the service they've been provided, and make sure that the resources have been made available to them, that's a good place to have those conversations. Doesn't mean it's time to gossip. It doesn't mean time to speculate on them, but you have to protect your people at all times. In a meeting, you can take it a little step further and talk about best approaches and best steps to take. Another good way to track your conduct and your content, and to ensure that you keep your funding in place. It's very important to avoid conflict, and conflict can happen in ways that we don't expect. You can have business dealings between people in a workplace. You can have family relationships, very common in the public safety sector, especially in smaller communities. You can have business relationships where people are doing business with each other on the job. You can have all kinds of issues like failed relationships in terms of the social implications. So really, really be aware of the potential for interpersonal conflict and avoid it as a peer. So as I mentioned, if you have additional or multiple units in your organization, the peers from each unit should get to know the folks in the other units in case they needed to be activated for those other programs from those other people. It's very likely that in a major trauma, it's going to be the other folks that are going to be activated to deal with your people, and you'll be activated to deal with their people in trauma because it's sometimes just too close to home. But when it comes to the stuff that people come to you with, what we affectionately refer to as the social work part, that's going to be you and your team. And that's because they know and trust you. In fact, the more trusted you are, the more people will start coming to you with stuff that doesn't sound like what you think is peer work at all. But it's where you're trusted. It's important. And here's a little caveat in terms of advocacy for people who may be struggling If you're in a workplace that has a collective agreement or there's labor relations issues going on, it's very important that you stay in your lane. So while you might want to suggest that someone has an accommodation or some additional consideration on a return to work, you have to be careful and recognize that there may be lots of other people involved in this conversation. So the metaphor that I always use for this is peers are kind of like tugboats in a harbor. You're never going to stop the organization if it gets out in the open ocean, and you'll never catch them in the strait. But inside of a harbor, you can nudge them into a slip into a bay and maybe encourage one to leave before the other one. That's sort of the tugboat thing. That's what we're kind of doing. We're encouraging people to make good decisions, and organizationally as a peer, what you're really trying to do is influence the thinking so that you can have some impact on the outcome. So as a wellness advocate, you need to challenge stigma often. And some workplaces are more stigmatized than others, but there are always some. And recognize, as I mentioned before, that a lot of stuff that we believe went into our heads when we were very, very young. And things like racism and that kind of stuff, those are all viruses that go in a very, very young brains. I'm not saying this is your brain, but be aware that a lot of stigma can't really be explained or defined by the people who exhibit it. It's part of a belief system that is based in shame. And one of the things that you can do as a peer is to be really aware of any language that sort of separates people from the group or identifies the other. Part of the peer thing is to be part of a system, and we can't have the other. We are all us. And be mindful of the language choices you make, but also the language choices that you accept around you. So one of the little tricks you can do when someone tells a joke that's highly stigmatized is pretend you don't get the joke and go, I don't get that. Can you explain that to me? And then they have to deconstruct the thing and realize that the story they're telling is, racist or homophobic or simply cruel. Can be really successful and doesn't leave everybody as embarrassed as other ways could. Something to think about, in the workplace as far as language choices is we use a lot of language that's stigmatizing towards mental health issues. Saying somebody's crazy, we can't be doing that as a peer. You can say the organization is making crazy decisions, so you don't have to completely remove that word from your lexicon, but we don't apply it to people. Another term that gets misused a lot is to say somebody's schizo. As if to say that multiple personality disorder is schizophrenia, which it absolutely is not. Multiple personality disorder has its own name, and I just said it. Schizophrenia is a separation or a schism from reality. So it's really unhelpful to use that term when we're supposed to be in the helping business. And another term we hear a lot that's just plain wrong is OCD. People with OCD aren't simply people who like to have clean hands. So, you can really hurt people and isolate them more by using that kind of language. It might seem friendly and folksy at the time, but somewhere in the story you're going to hurt somebody. We're spending a little bit of time on behavioral cause. It's very important as a peer support person that you discourage others from diagnosing and we don't engage in diagnosing ourselves. But a little bit of background is important. It's important that we don't apply a mental health behavioral cause to all different behaviors. There's lots of times when people's behaviors that we see are driven by issues we simply don't understand. Some behaviors are going to mask other issues. I once had a fellow that worked for me on one of my stations who was suddenly really agitated about the hose dryer, which is like a big old baker's oven that we put wet hose in it and it dries it off, and it just vented back into the apparatus bay, and he was really agitated about it. I had to spend a little time with him and figure out what was really going on. And he was a workplace cancer survivor, and he and his wife had lost a child early in the gestational period, and she had just been diagnosed with breast cancer. He was so afraid that he had brought something home that had made his wife sick, that had hugely affected his behavior, and we needed to get him some help for that. Mostly what we needed to do was just listen to him. So as we try to avoid diagnosis, we also try to be aware that there can be circumstances and symptoms and signs that are present that could mean a lot of different things. You look at something like chest pain. Oh, someone's exhibiting chest pain. Well, what can it be? Well, right off the top of your head, of course it could be an MI, but it could be indigestion, it could be bronchitis, it could be cracked rib or damage to the intercostal muscles. Lots of stuff can cause chest pain that isn't the immediate first thing we think of. So we need to approach this thing from a clinical perspective. And by clinical, we mean that which we can observe. We talk about behaviors we can observe. We don't talk about things we diagnose. So here's another example. Here's some stuff that looks like mental health issues that isn't. People who have blood sugar issues, people with infections, people with injuries, people who would have their vascular system compromised. People are having interactions with medications. People who have maybe taken some alcohol and mixed with medications. People who are sleep deprived, including ourselves, can very much conduct themselves as those that are having a mental health experience or issue. A lot of it is just health, and we need to look at this as a whole health thing.